Hello everyone, this is Janine and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time visiting, then thanks for hanging out with me. And if you're returning, welcome back. This video is really going to be about my reflections of what's happening in the world and as it relates to the fight for equality and justice and Black Lives Matter. And I will definitely segue into talking about vulnerable Black women, not strong Black women. So if you can get with that, and even if you can't, I hope that you stay around and just listen to my reflections. I haven't felt like recording videos about hauls or gardening or even Bible art journaling. I've definitely felt like I needed to get this off my chest before I could go back to creating some much more lighthearted videos on this channel. So I'm going to begin my reflections with sharing a couple of events from my life that are true, and I haven't thought about them in a long time. I had really wanted to, and I may get emotional. So I'm from Brooklyn, New York, and one day my sister and I were in the elevator. We were preteen, and we were on our way back from walking the dog. Her name was Dominique. We had a German Shepherd. And when we started to exit the elevator, the neighbor, who was a white man, had a butcher knife in his hand, and he tried to attack my sister and I. He wasn't able to get into the elevator because Dominique was on her job and she kept him away from us. We were able to get back downstairs and then eventually get back in the house. Now, when I say the next door neighbor, this was our apartment. He was right across the hall. When we were able to get home safely, and when the police came, they arrested my mother and her boyfriend. Nothing happened to the white man who came at us with a butcher knife, I believe with the full intent of killing us. And the reason my mother and her boyfriend were arrested was because the white man complained that people were knocking on his door, literally. So this is New York and Brooklyn. If you don't understand how Black people can have issues with the police, I hope that by me telling you this true story from my life that you will have a better understanding. My mother, who's now deceased, and her boyfriend were taken away, and when she came back, she told us the story that the judge had sentenced them to Rikers Island and 3.5 years, and for knocking on a white man's door, mind you, this white man who tried to kill me and my sister with a butcher knife, and nothing happened to him. He was not arrested. They didn't take a nothing happened to him. Someone else's public defender came to their defense and stop this. So if you have any question about, now this was in less than a 24-hour span that they were arrested and taken away and nearly put in prison. That's not due process, right? So when you hear these stories about people being put in prison for suspicion of stealing a backpack, and that young man killed himself, and I decided when I did this video that I wasn't going to do a whole bunch of research. I'm sorry, I don't remember his name right this minute. But if you can imagine that it happened just like that, and maybe you've heard these stories and you don't believe them, well, they happened. Now, this was more than 30 years ago, right, in New York. But these type of injustices happen all the time. So the police were very happy to take my mother and her boyfriend away because of white man's inconvenience. The same white man who tried to kill my sister and I with a butcher knife. So that's the first story I'll tell you. When I was older, fast forward to me being in graduate school. No, it was after graduate school, and was in a really terrible situation. Won't even call it a relationship. This was a person who just simply wouldn't leave me alone, wouldn't leave my life, was seeing a woman, and was literally squatting in my home. And I walked into this trap like a fool. Nonetheless, what I needed to happen was rescue. What happened was the police did absolutely nothing. There was an occasion where he climbed up 3 stories from the back. It was 3 stories from the ground, broke broke the glass. It was a large sliding door. I had a balcony, and he broke in. And when I came home from work early in the morning, like 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, there he was in my house. Called the police on me, and I promise you, they left him sitting right on my couch, even with the evidence that he had actually broken in. I had to turn around and go to work very early the next day. And I spoke to my aunt, and she called the chief of police. And that never occurred to me to actually call the chief of police or demand to speak to someone's supervisor. And she threatened to file a lawsuit. And then they sent the SWAT team. But you know what? They did not arrest him. So all kind of rigmarole happened. The police came to my job. I gave a very lengthy statement. I had been telling them, he's violent. I don't want him here. He's squatting. This is terrible. They didn't help me. And I was just really trying to survive and be sane. This was the type of situation I had always wanted to avoid, and worked so hard in choosing any type of association or relationship, because I witnessed my mother go through terrible, terrible domestic violence, and the police didn't help her either. So, but back to my situation, they didn't, this was a black man. This was a black man, which had me start thinking about structures and hierarchies. And what eventually happened was I was able to get an order of protection, get him away from me. Mind you, he was seeing a woman. He just wouldn't leave me alone. And tried to get on the path of some type of healing and restoration. I felt, I was very deeply wounded. Long pause. So that's story number 2. The third story I'll share with you is not nearly so dark. I was at a funeral. This was several years ago, and I was in Paris, Tennessee, and didn't get real good cell phone reception. So as we moved east, as we traveled east, I noticed all these missed calls. Well, my neighbors were calling me because my alarm had gone off. Someone had kicked in my back door, and the alarm went off, and the police responded very quickly, and the sirens were going off. They didn't take anything. They were scared away by the sound. And so I gave my neighbor my alarm code, and what they did was they barricaded the door as best as they could, the back door, and then they exited through the front door and just locked the bottom lock. So the police responded exactly as they should have, and very quickly, to an alarm. And it made me think about how sometimes property is valued over people, but it also caused me, as I've been reflecting about what's been happening with Black Lives Matter and the fight for just equality, racial equality, gender equality, Not to take anything away from Black Lives Matter. I'm a Black woman. I have experienced racism. I've been called the N-word. I've been followed around the store. I've had people refuse to accept checks from me, right, before debit cards. And I've also had white people refuse to call me by my professional credential, which is doctor. I have an earned PhD in psychology. And on one occasion, I went to the bank to cash a check that was written to Dr. Miller, and the woman wouldn't cash it. She said, "Why is this written to Dr. Miller?" I said, "Because that's who I am." And she went to her manager and showed the man. I assumed this was a manager because she walked away from the teller, from the booth, and went to the other side of the floor to someone's office to show them the check. And then she cashed the check. Real nasty, okay? Terrible customer service. I've been through that when I wore my hair in a very short natural. It's still natural, it's just flat ironed. I started getting pulled over on a regular basis. This was at least 10 years ago, before natural hairstyles became even more common than they are now. Which, let me just make a point that the chemicals and chemical relaxers, and I'm not talking about straightening combs, but the chemicals and chemical relaxers have been shown to cause disease and been linked to disease in Black women, but they're still on the market, right? It's like $1 billion industry, okay? So that's one way that racism plays out in the marketplace. So what I'm saying, I would really rather somebody refuse to accept my check, or I have to go to my bank and cash a check, than to actually need to be rescued from a violent situation and the police don't do a damn thing, okay? Or they don't hold a person of any race accountable for trying to kill me, right? You know, there's different levels, not even levels, but there's different ways in which racism plays out in our lives. And what came to me is this phrase of over-policed and under-protected. And so Black communities are over-policed. But what I'm going to highlight right now is how Black women are under-protected. And we are under-protected. We're likely to be killed by domestic violence. We are likely to be victims of crime. If we fight back with lethal violence, we're likely to be incarcerated. And we are likely to experience a whole host of healthcare disparities, which are attributable to racism. There was a study done years ago, and I intentionally didn't do a bunch of research before I filmed this because I'm the person who starts with facts and data first rather than emotion. And so let me just, if you can Google it, if you're interested. But my point is that I believe it was Harvard who did this study on healthcare disparities and concluded that, when all things are controlled for, age, income, access, healthcare disparities boil down to racism. True story. My mother died when she was 45 years old. She died in her sleep very peacefully. She was on a medication named cardizem, and that medication has been proven to cause abnormally low levels of blood pressure in African American women. Well, blood pressure is a vital sign, isn't it? Your heart needs to be beating to keep you alive. Yet this doctor prescribed that medication to my mother, who was obviously African American. She was not racially ambiguous looking at all, okay? And then it took nearly a year to get the autopsy results back. Now, out of respect and obedience to my grandmother, the matriarch of the family, the family decided not to sue. I really wish we had. That was one time that there should have been some pushback against grandma, but we didn't. And it just is a concrete example of how Black women die because of racism. that's expressed in the medical community, whether it's the wrong medication. And my mother had access, she had health insurance, and she had a physician who gave her the wrong medication. So I know that there are people who don't have access, and there are people who do have access, and they still die. I think that it is fortunate that two celebrities, Serena Williams and Beyonce, have shared their experiences. Serena Williams was very ill and kept insisting that something was wrong, and finally they did something. I believe she had embolism, which are clots, and Beyonce had a whole bunch of stuff, toxemia and all of that. Now, they both had conditions that could have resulted in death in childbirth. So we know that black women are more likely to die in childbirth. And these are women who have insurance and who have access. So what am I saying? As I reflect on being a black woman and my vulnerabilities, I think I want to be honored for being a vulnerable black woman who is worthy and deserving of protection and nurture and care. Don't call me a strong black woman. Just don't. I worked out today and did a lot of hang power cleans and threw some weights around and some push presses up over the head and did bodybuilders and all that. Yeah, that's great. That's building my cardiovascular system. That's building my body. And I've been on this weight loss journey. Another story for you. When I started gaining weight extremely quickly, I went to the doctor repeatedly and said, something is wrong. I'm gaining weight like every week. And she didn't do anything. And she was a black woman. She said, push away from the table. Black women eating ham hocks and collard greens, which was racist. Or prejudice, right? And get my systems talk straight. But I went on to gain a whole lot of weight. My thyroid is always normal. But something was clearly wrong for me to put on a huge amount of weight in a year. And it took getting to an endocrinologist to explain why the weight gain happened and why I would be slow to lose it, and all of that. So I've been fighting that battle. That happened years ago as well. But black women still experience doctors who don't listen to them. I have a great doctor now. She listens. We have a great relationship. She also happens to be a white woman. Dr. Craig, if you ever see this video, I think you're doing a good job. Great job. Thank you. But let me get back to what I was talking about, which was vulnerability and the ways in which people, even black people, are highly resistant to seeing black women as vulnerable. How did that even happen? We were taken, if you're descended from slaves, I believe I'm descended from slaves. I have no evidence to the contrary. And the rapes started on the shore, the gang rapes. And then if you survived the Middle Plastics, you came, brought here to be a slave. Beat, raped, bred like a dog. Literally. You couldn't keep your children safe from the same thing. You weren't allowed to marry. Okay? Were prohibited from marrying. And men couldn't keep their families safe. Hit with the bullwhip. All kind of things. And then the whole Jim Crow. And so as I think about it, I'm like, where did this strong black woman come from? Is it because of people know that we're more likely to be abused or raped or murdered or poor? And strong now becomes an excuse not to act, to be indifferent. If she can handle it, no. I've been through situations that I could not handle. I needed help. I needed rescue. So did my mother. So did my sister. So do some of the black women who I know who have shared their stories with me. Black women are more likely to be poor, to be underpaid for the exact same work. I think it's like 65 cents on the dollar or 74 cents on the dollar. I don't know, but it's not a dollar for a dollar. As I reflect on my career, I've been so fortunate I was blessed. I went to college on a scholarship. I went to graduate school on a fellowship, and I've worked, and I've had failures and I've had successes. I'm really grateful to God for how God has manifested in my life. But I also know that it's exhausting to have to produce more work than a white person. I had a job, this is going back probably 10 years or so, and or less, maybe about 7 to 8 years or so, whatever. Anyway, I was working 12 and 13 hours a day, working every weekend until my niece was born. So I stopped going in on Sundays. When I had a new supervisor, she said, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to stop working on weekend and all these crazy hours. I was really appreciative of that. So the supervisor I had at the time advocated for me, hired me, advocated for me to get a great salary, but I was working twice as many hours as anybody else. So what you just did was lower my hourly wage. I was also covering for someone who was a very nice young lady, but in the wrong position. She just simply wasn't ready for that level of leadership. So some of the ways that racism has, for me, played out in the workplace is these absolutely ridiculous level of expectations. And there I was, working myself into not being healthy, let's put it that way, to try to meet them and not complaining. One of the ways that I am guilty and I have been complicit in racism against me is failing to complain at the appropriate times, regardless of the consequence. One of the things that I did recently was complain about some stuff. And, it was like taking a weight off of me. And I thought, my gosh, why didn't I do that sooner? Well, I know why. Because silence and just having your head down and working is a protective measure. I know why, And I'm trying to stay with the tension because I know that Black people aren't the only one who have certain experiences, but I'm just trying to stay with the tension of dealing with the reality of being a Black woman, okay? So the other thing I wanted to mention was that, well, you know what? Maybe I think I'll just stop there, Now I will mention this. Periodically, this appears on social media, and it does actually have its truth. It's based in reality, and that is the gynecological experiments that were performed on Black women. So imagine, if you will, being a Black woman and your body being cut open and you be given a full hysterectomy without any anesthesia, while doctors and nurses experiment on you and people watch, treating you just like lower than a dog, right? Dissecting you like a frog. And you're alive at the start. And you don't have any anesthesia. And they think that's totally acceptable. One of the things that slavery did was so totally distort the moral compass of America. And we're still living with that today. Just like those police officers thought it was right and morally right and legally defensible to arrest my mother and her boyfriend for knocking on a white man's door and to not take any action against the white man who tried to kill me and my sister. They thought that was right. So we're in this struggle because it's not even about being followed around the store. It's about the worldview and the truth of what is right and what is wrong. That's what we're fighting for. That's what people are fighting for. Taking a stance on what is right and what is acceptable and what's absolutely unacceptable is essential. It is absolutely essential. But back to the gynecological experiments. So Black women were considered to be soulless animals who did not experience any pain. Strong Black women. I think that what we see, the indifference and the callousness to when Black women experience pain is directly linked to chattel slavery in America and the perspective of Black women being inhuman, less than human, and unworthy and undeserving of humane treatment. Slavery was not a humane, benevolent institution. One of the things that you can do is, if you have children, is tell them the truth, and at an age appropriate level. Slaves were not workers, right? There's so much more that I could say, and there are people who have studied this, Black women in America, the intersection, misogynoir, and all of that, hating Black women, hating women. All I can share is and they're very eloquent. All I can do is share my experience, my lived real experience, and say the truth. I've also been reflecting on not being part of the problem. Are there any ways in which I, as a Black woman, am I complicit in systems of oppression? I think one way that I have been complicit has been failing to speak when I could, and failing to complain when I could. I know that this is my generation. You were taught to get your education and keep your head down and work. There's value in that. I have a very strong work ethic, but there's also time to complain. And I'm really proud of peaceful protesters who are standing their ground and speaking up in ways that I didn't. I use silence as my defense. But not anymore. I'm changing in that way. I understand why people are angry and why they are looting. I understand that, even though I don't condone it. I really do understand it. I don't have any advice. I don't have any answers. I can't even tell you really how to help. But just want to put a few things out there, which is that build relationships with people who are different from you. Allow them into your space. I'm notorious for not allowing people into my space. I simply don't have many people in my home of any color, and why not? When I have, I would say, solid acquaintances who are white people, why not have them over for a meal in my space? Why not have Black women over for a meal in my space, and we can fellowship and support one another and be honest with one another? I think one way you can help, just consider that you may be the person who says, have you considered calling the chief of police? Have you considered getting a different doctor? Do you know that you can call the number on the back of your insurance card and request assistance? Because there could be a Black woman who is intelligent and educated, but who is also so burdened or stressed out with life, who's not really thinking clearly about a particular situation. So maybe just offer, in a kind and gentle and respectful way, some practical feedback. Or be the sounding board when someone is dealing with something at work. And don't contribute to the problem by saying, I don't think that's happening. Say, you know what? Yeah, I see that too. I think that is happening. You can complain. I'll stand with you. As a matter of fact, I'm going to tell the truth about that person. You know what they say about advice giving and how useful it is, right? You know what? I think I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to stop there. Just some of my reflections on being a vulnerable Black woman. I pray that all is well in your world, and that, as always, that you are blessed. Until next time, bye now.